Okay, hello everyone. A bit of a new thing, but I thought I'd give it a go. Just to kind of talk you through these slides, really. So lesson 2 on advertorials. I know Sophie posted something earlier in the week about research. Now moving on to lesson 2 for the NEA. So the main question here, okay, we've spoken about the advertorial. It's part of your brief. One of your 4 pages that you have to produce is an advertorial. The big question really, what is an advertorial? Okay. And essentially to go back in time a little bit will help us to understand what an advertorial is. Okay. So in any sector really, at some point, adverts in their just pure basic form became so commonplace that audience tend to just kind of skim past them. Same for print. So in a print publication, just placed adverts became so commonplace that readers got to a point where they just overlooked them, skimmed past them, and the original commercial value of a placed advert in a magazine became more and more diluted. Part of the reason for that is the advertising industry has expanded into so many different avenues, different directions. There are different ways to promote a brand, all of those kinds of things, so that the traditional single page or double page advert just became more and more diluted. So as more creative opportunities developed for advertising, so the traditional single cell advert, one page, one message, it became less engaging to the reader. So it's not worth as much. And having to compete for business in advertising, that advert became less and less appealing, I guess, had less value to it. So it's important to note, actually, at this point, we do still see adverts in print, obviously, just as much as ever before, really. It's just that advertorials, which we'll talk about in just a moment, seem to have arrived in addition to that. It's more about expanding the opportunities for a magazine to commercialise their content and to make more money instead of just replacing the print advert. This is just, in addition to, we can also make money in this way. So, and that's really clear to see. The next time you're in a supermarket, which obviously is not going to be anytime soon, I wouldn't have thought, just pick up a copy of Vogue if you can find one, have a little flick through it, just pick it up off the shelf, have a flick through, and you'll see wall-to-wall adverts. You're looking at a magazine there that's half an inch thick, and it's £4, £5, something like that. And you think, wow, there's a lot of content in here for the money. A lot of it is just single-placed adverts. So the adverts are still there, but the advertorial has been the sort of next step for commercialising content. So let's have a look at what that looks like. What we've got here is not an advertorial. This is a traditional advert to the left and a simple one-page editorial piece to the right. Okay, we'll look at the advert first. It's a one-page ad for Spotify. We could analyse this advert from a media language and a representation point of view. I don't want to go too much down that road today. We've done quite a lot of that stuff already. But just looking on the surface here, what we can see is a consistent house style with the Spotify branding. Okay, so the colours that are used, typeface that's used, the overall style of the advert. Even if you took the word Spotify out of it, it's clearly an advert for Spotify. They've got their logo in the middle there. So we've got that consistent house style with the Spotify branding. It's quite a stripped back layout. In a way, it's not that complicated, is it? It's a simple 2D design, and it's focused on promoting the brand and their position within the marketplace, which is your music wherever you are. Okay, so they're positioning Spotify as that. Okay, a music provider that provides music to you wherever you are. They're saying that's what we do. That is what we're about. The artwork reinforces that message with this kind of Spotify logo being presented as a kind of a global brand, lots of kind of iconic designs going on there. So they're trying to tap into that global audience. But it's not what we would call an informative advert, and it's not a hard sell. It may just be a bit of an enigma, making us think, well, audience want to find out more about that. Don't really understand that. I might want to find out more. So it's quite enigmatic, isn't it, really? But it's certainly not a hard sell. It's not go and do this. It's more of a soft sell, certainly. But it's just a simple advert to keep the audience connected to the brand, to get that logo in front of our faces in a fun kind of way. Or it could be to inspire that traditional media audience that are opening a magazine, traditional form of media, trying to get them to explore new forms of media and to find out more about the brand. Could be what it is. To the right of the slide here, we've got a really simple one-page editorial piece. And just looking at this on the face of it, it does follow some magazine conventions, albeit presenting them in a slightly different way to the mainstream magazine. I'm not familiar with this brand. It's probably some major magazine brand that I should know, but I've pulled this single page editorial piece off the internet. I don't know which magazine brand it's placed in. But for example, we do have a heading. Yeah, it's in italics, but so we've got a heading there, but it's presented in a slightly different way. We've got a drop cap at the start of the paragraph. Yep, no worries there. And while the paragraph is set in a column, it's in one column, and it's pretty much entirely justified, fully justified text, which means it goes all the way from the left side of the column to the right side of the column. There's no ragged edge, so to speak. So while we have got the use of those conventions there, the drop cap, the heading, the column, it's quite unusual to see one column going across the majority of a page. So, we've also got images there with captions. Have we got a pull quote? I don't think so. Enjoy May Brit. That might be a pull quote. It's not in quotations, but it's sort of presented as a pull quote. So again, this editorial piece is following magazine conventions, but it's presenting them in slightly different ways. So maybe this magazine is a brand that generally tries to break the mold. I don't really know, because I don't know the title of the magazine. But we have got some conventions there, page number, date at the bottom, use of images. There's kind of a main image, but it's not, the majority of the page. Then we've got the column there and that kind of thing. So essentially, I guess what may have happened is one day some bright spark probably said, readers like to read editorial pieces and they remain engaged in them because the content is interesting, the design is interesting. Why don't we talk about certain products or services in these editorial pieces and sell them to clients? That's probably as simple as it was. So that would be like combining an advert with an editorial piece, and the really original term, advertorial, was then created. Okay, so just seeing what that looks like. I've highlighted a few things here. I've not written on there what they are. So, maybe have a look at this and you can decide what they are, if you like. So this crazy new concept of advertorial is really not that new anymore. Okay, but back at the time when this was first come up with, I guess it was quite a new idea. So what I've got on the page here is a single page advertorial. It's nice because it follows the design conventions of an editorial piece, but the content is commercially driven. The image quality is not very good there, so it's quite hard to read. But if we're just looking at the design, we can see the design on the page quite easily. Okay, so I talk about an editorial piece with commercially driven content, and I know what you're thinking. Isn't that misleading the audience? We'll come back to that point very shortly. So if you're having that thought, well done for having that thought, but we will come back to that. Okay. The page layout is quite pleasing to the eye. There's a main image, some smaller images. The text is set in columns. Okay, we've got columns of text there. We've got the use of a drop cap. We've got the use of a pull quote. And some of the things I've added arrows to are some of the typical magazine conventions that we expect to see in an article or an editorial piece. But what you'll notice is at the top, it says Look Promotion. I'm guessing Look is the name of the publication, but this is a keyword that's placed on the page to flag to the audience that it's a paid for promotion, and therefore this content is commercially driven. I say commercially driven. What I mean is a company has paid, a company has paid for this magazine to place these things in there. Okay, so it's commercial revenue from the magazine. So some sales exec has sold this piece to a client for a fee. So we often see advertorial pieces taking the form of how-to guides or life hacks, that kind of thing. 5 steps to this, and this one's similar, isn't it? Step 1, step 2, step 3, you're going to get that look. So it's, the idea is that it's presented as being a piece that's going to help out the reader, beneficial to the reader, but there's commercial content in there. Okay, so that's where it's trying to keep the reader engaged. In some ways, that kind of approach to commercializing this kind of content has been, I wouldn't say it's been driven by social media, but social media has certainly increased this type of content, brought it to the foreground, made the audience feel more comfortable with consuming commercial content in this way. So I think in a way social media has helped the magazine industry to place this kind of advertorial content because it's, BuzzFeed and things like that, we see a lot of these kinds of things, content that's been paid for and it's a step-by-step guide or whatever. Okay. Social media really can utilize this revenue model for selling content very, very well, because it can then also be shared. And, I don't really need to tell you about all of those things that social media can do, but I'm sure you can imagine how this kind of content works particularly well in a social media space. So just to bring it back to the brief, if you check your NEA brief, those of you that are doing the magazine brief, which I think is pretty much everyone, you must produce an advertorial as part of task 2. Okay, you're making 4 pages in total, and one of them has to be a single page advertorial. This could be for a product or a service, but it has to relate to the magazine and the overall content of the magazine. So for example, just off the top of my head, 5 ways to train for a marathon could be like an advertorial thing, and it could be to promote some Nike trainers, and it could be placed in a fitness magazine. That's just off the top of my head there, but straight away you've got a content piece that's going to appeal to a fitness reader, and it ties in with a fitness brand. Okay, really simple, but the exam board are looking for you to make those links. So check the brief, make sure you follow the requirements for the advertorial very carefully, because there are bullet points in there of things you have to complete. Make sure you complete those things. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment, because I want to talk about this issue about potentially misleading an audience by creating an advert that looks like an editorial piece, and it's a matter of regulation. One of the key phrases I want you to keep in mind and come back to time and time again when we talk about regulation is that media industries are regulated to protect vulnerable audiences. That is a key phrase. Okay, believe me, if you work in the media industry, if you go on to work in the media industry, you're going to have to get to know this terminology, because on a day-to-day basis, you have to keep that in mind. Okay, it's easy to see the word regulation and feel like you're having something taken away from you, And I guess in some ways you are, by the industry being regulated. But you have to take this as a wider picture. Okay, we exist in a democratic, free society, and when products are circulated to a mass audience, we have to understand that some of that mass audience are vulnerable members of the public. They may not understand things in certain ways, and anyone can be a vulnerable audience and can be easily manipulated, or can take offence to something or harm. So we have to make sure that those vulnerable members of the mass audience are protected from harm and offence. The question really around regulation is, how on earth do you do that? How do you begin to protect certain types of audience whilst allowing the mass audience to remain free to consume products and react them in whichever way they want? It's very difficult. That's not really a debate that we've got time to go into today, but that is the difficult position that our regulatory bodies find themselves in. And in a way, it's a paradox, isn't it? That can never be resolved, because there's always going to be a need for compromise, and a compromise has to be found. So we can each kind of sit there and decide whether we think our regulation system works or not at the moment, but as a student, you need to know what the system is that's currently in place, why that system is in place, and you need to really understand where those compromises sit and why. By all means, question the system, explore other ideas, but in the final exam, just know what the current setup is. Okay, how are we currently regulated and why? Beyond that exam, which is, the real big picture, by all means, question the regulatory system that we have in place. Look at other regulatory systems. Why do different countries regulate in different ways? And what is right and what is wrong is really a kind of ideological viewpoint, but we can explore that topic another day. Certainly in component 1 and 2, we'll be covering regulation in a lot more depth. So next big question, we talk about regulation. Who regulates advertising in the UK? It's mainly regulated by one organisation known as the ASA. If they come knocking on your door, well, they don't go knocking on people's doors, but, metaphorically, then you may have some questions to answer, who knows. So in the UK, advertising across media is regulated by the ASA. These are the Advertising Standards Authority. It's their role to ensure that all advertisements comply with codes which are written by the Committee of Advertising Practice. Okay, so they're essentially policing this, and they're in an element they are reactive, but they're also proactive. So the ASA act on complaints reactively, and then they proactively check the media to ensure that there are no advertisements that are misleading or causing harm and offence to anyone. But we're particularly interested in protecting vulnerable audiences. There are two sets of codes. One is for broadcast and one is for non-broadcast. So the ASA have really taken many forms over the years, but they basically divide it into these two categories now. The code for broadcast, which used to be known as the BCAP code, the Broadcasting Code of Advertising Practice, and then the code for online, which never previously existed. Excuse me. The online code, it exists now, and it has come in relatively recent times. I remember adverts on the radio. I should have researched what year that came in my lesson prep, but I remember adverts on the radio not that long ago, really, saying that the internet was adverts on the internet in the UK were now being regulated by the ASA. So it's relatively recent. So on a day-to-day basis, let's say for example, you were employed as someone that was involved in the design and placement or the selling of adverts in a media product. you'd need to be across the relevant code of practice for your area. So for me, as a broadcast producer, that's going to be the broadcasting code from the ASA. The broadcasting code from the ASA sits alongside Ofcom's broadcasting code. Okay, so the keen ones amongst you will be saying, well, where does Ofcom fit into this? Ofcom's code dictates what you can and cannot say within editorial pieces, whereas the ASA are more interested in advertising, or their code governs advertising. So broadcast is quite a good example because it's very easy to make the distinction between the two. When you're watching a television program, for example, the program you're watching falls under Ofcom's broadcasting code, and that program has to follow that code. And then when it cuts across to an ad break, those adverts then fall under the ASA code. So, really easy. Ofcom's governing programming content and the ASA are governing advertising content. Where it becomes a bit of a grey area, again, here we are again in this grey area, is when we talk about advertorial pieces. Because, yes, you're right, it is a bit of a grey area, but the Ofcom code will state how commercial content needs to be flagged up to the audience, and the ASA code will highlight what rules that content has to follow. So it's a little bit of both. So the Ofcom code, for example, the Ofcom broadcasting code, I think section 9 talks about commercialising content and at what point does an advertorial become an advert, and then it falls under the ASA's remit. And the ASA's code will talk about, I can't remember which section, but that will talk about what you can and can't say within an advertorial from an advertising point of view. You cannot say this is the best computer in the world unless you have a way to substantiate that claim. Okay, so that commercial message has to fall under the ASA code. It'd be really useful it'd be really useful to look at both of those codes, and perhaps later on, once you've designed your advertorial, we can pretend that we're the ASA and Ofcom, and we'll see what we think of that advertorial and whether or not it follows the code. So each sector in the media has different regulatory bodies. I've just given you an example of broadcast there because it's quite an easy one to understand. But you get an idea of how these different bodies work together. So, for example, when a client sponsors a radio show on a commercial radio station and someone has to produce that, the producer needs to be aware of the ASA code, the Ofcom code, and how they work together with those different sections that I mentioned. It's such a minefield sometimes when you're actually working in the industry, and you may have to be responding to many briefs that fall under this. I don't want to kind of reflect on it. I don't want to keep bringing it up too much, but it's not unusual for a producer in a commercial environment to be responding to maybe 7 or 8 briefs a day. That's a lot to be across, and the more you do it, obviously the more comfortable you get. But companies sometimes think it's very risky to rely on an individual's knowledge of this code. So while we're very clued up, it's risky to assume that we know what we're doing, because there's no legal qualification that a producer has to undertake to say, yes, they know these codes. So the point I'm trying to make is there are some third-party companies that charge for consultancy on this, such as the RACC, the Radio Advertising Clearance Centre, and you can pay money for them to look at your commercial script for your advertorial piece, and they will say, yes, that follows the code, or no, it doesn't. However, if it breaks the code, if they were wrong, they've got no comeback on that at all. It's the publisher that is responsible for that. Okay, so if the magazine has published an advert that breaks the code, they can't say, oh, that advisory body told me it would be okay. They are responsible for that. So the ASA would be looking at them for an explanation. So, we've gone into quite a lot of depth on regulation there, and it's a big idea to discuss. And the importance of protecting vulnerable audiences from harm and offence shouldn't be overlooked It's a really, really important thing for us to understand before we go into the media industry. So as I've said, we will explore this a lot more in Component 1 and Component 2, certainly under Industry and Audience, Section B. But for Component 3, you do have to demonstrate that you understand how to produce an advertorial that follows the rules, essentially. If you're producing an advertorial that meets the brief and follows the rules, great. You're in a really good position there to get some really good marks. So there is an opportunity for you to briefly mention your understanding of this in your statement of aims when you set out basically what you intend to do. So there's a couple of tasks that I want you to do. First of all, find 2 print advertorials. They're not that difficult to find. You should be able to find a couple online. Single page is a good way to go. Identify what is the brand and what is the message. Analyze, why has this brand been placed in this magazine? So you're going to need to know the magazine it's placed in. And why has it been placed in this magazine in this particular way? Why not just a single page advert? Why an advertorial? What's the benefit to the client and to the audience? Describe, is there a link between the magazine brand and the advertorial brand? To what extent are those brands closely related? Just for a few extra marks, I want you to, if you do have the chance to, research the idea of synergy. Okay, synergy is where you bring 2 things together, and the overall result is far greater than if those 2 things had have worked separately. So research what synergy is and to what extent the advertorials you've found demonstrate synergy between the brands or between the messages. Okay. In this assignment on Google Classroom, there's a template for you to fill in. I've only added 1 slide for task 1. I would say you're definitely going to need to add a couple more slides in there. You're probably not going to be able to summarize this on 1 slide, and the same for task 2. So once you've completed task 1, you should have a really good understanding of advertorials. Move on to task 2, okay, and decide on the basic elements of your advertorial. What product or service will you center your advertorial around? I wouldn't suggest creating a product or a service. Choose something that already exists because you're going to need to take photographs of it. So decide what product or service it's going to be. What will the overall message to the audience be? And how do you expect them to respond to it? Okay. What is your intended message to the audience? What kind of image would you like to use? I should have said images. I think you need more than 1. You don't need to tell me exactly, but talk about the kind of images that you're going to use. Do be quite specific in the sense that, I'm going to have a close-up of an iPhone, for example, the shot type, but you don't have to say it's going to be this color iPhone, it's going to be held by this person. Don't go into too much detail. I want to get an idea of what it is that you're going to do. What kind of design and colors are you going to use in your advertorial, and why? Don't just say, I'm going to use bold font to make it stand out. I'm going to use bright colors to make it stand out. Well, if the magazine is full of bright colors and bold fonts, then it's not going to stand out, is it? So, yes, by all means use bold fonts, but really why are you using those bold fonts and why have you chosen those particular colors? Okay. So I've said create a single page document to summarize this. What I mean is fill in that template on Google Classroom. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Or, if this is Ross's class or Sophie's class, put your comments in the section below and I'm sure that they'll try and keep an eye on answering them as well. Okay, thanks very much.